Hey everyone, Rick here, and I thought I could do a little talk-through battle report showing pictures of a recent game of Battlefields of Mana. And here is today's prize, the Ruby Ring of the Baron, left vacant after he was slain recently. Up for grabs is this territory and his ring. And here is today's battlefield, a small hamlet in the center of the barony. Fertile soil makes this territory very desirable. This is going to be a 12-point Battlefields of Mana battle. Let's talk about each army now, beginning with the Regal Guard. This is the Dawn Regiment. So 12 points of Regal Guard including, and we'll start in the top left, with a 3-point unit of Axemen. Going clockwise, we have a 3-point unit of mounted archers with a unit commander attached for an extra point. Then on the right, we have another 3-point unit of axemen. And then on the bottom left, we have a 2-point unit of swordsmen. And here are the Lunar Knights. This is the Midnight Division, starting on the left with a 2-point unit of spearmen. Right next to them in the center of the picture is a 5-point unit of heavy cavalry. Right in front of the heavy cavalry is another 2-point unit of spearmen. And then more in the upper right, we have a 1-point unit of Peasant Militia. And then in between the Peasant Militia and the heavy cavalry, kind of at an angle there, is a 2-point unit of mounted militia. And here is initial deployment. We have Regal Guard on the left, Lunar Knights on the right. Lunar Knights won the roll-off to not only go first, deploy first, but also choose on which side of the battlefield they wanted to deploy. They chose this side because they figured they can navigate through those woods without much issue, navigate around that dwelling without much issue, have a little bit of a road which will increase their movement, but more importantly, stick the Regal Guard behind that movement hindering crop field and also a dwelling, so it would limit their options. So here is Regal Guard deployment a little closer up. We have swordsmen on the left. We have the mounted archers with their unit commander next to them. And then on the right, we have the 2 units of axemen. So the thought here was the mounted archers could traverse through that field pretty easily. And having them in the center gives them full range of the entire board through which to fire. Now the axes on the right, especially that rightmost axeman unit, is as close to the road as they can get. Now, axe units are fairly slow. They're only a movement of 3 inches. Of course, you can take both actions on a turn to move twice, but what this means is that the axemen need any advantage they can get to speed things up and get across the battlefield, because these 2 units of axes are going to be the hardest hitting units that the Regal Guard have. So the one on the right is going to try, hopefully, to get up there onto the road. Beginning your movement action on a road adds 2 inches to each movement action. And then the axeman unit next to them has, right on the other side of the building, has clear movement path to move forward. And then on the far left are the swords. They are going to go straight past the field and hopefully, prevent anyone from trying to flank those archers. Now for our dear friends, the Lunar Knights and their deployment, starting left, moving right. On the far left are the Peasant Militia. Why? Well, we have that dwelling there. We don't want anyone on that side of the board to sneak up along that left flank and get behind the line. So that Peasant Militia unit, kind of a throwaway unit, we're sticking them way up there so they can move forward a little bit just to plug up that gap and prevent anyone from sneaking around that dwelling into our rear. So then next to them is the first unit of spears. We deployed them right there on the road so that they will instantly be able to start off with a speed advantage and move directly up the battlefield. Next to them are our heavy hitters, the heavy cavalry. They have no hindrance in terms of terrain. They can move their full speed straight ahead and get right into the mix, which is exactly where we want them. Or I guess I should say the Lunar Knight player, where we want them. So then next to them are the mounted militia. Now there wasn't a whole lot of options left of where to deploy units, so someone was going to have to deal with those woods, which cut your movement allowance in half. What better unit to do that than with the mounted militia, who are still fast because they are still cavalry, so they should be able to get straight up through those woods without too much problem. And that leaves our second unit of spearmen over there on the far right. Nothing is in front of them. Stick them over there, hold off that flank, and move them straight up the battlefield, also with no hindrances. And here is how things look at the end of round 1. So there are 6 rounds to a game. Each round consists of each player, each side taking a turn. So like we mentioned, the Lunar Knights deployed first and they went first. Now deployment first, I should also elaborate on, meant that initially, the Lunar Knights place a unit on their board edge. Regal Guard respond by placing a unit on their board edge. Lunar Knights place a second unit. Regal Guard places a second unit, and so on. So the Lunar Knights deployed first, and then now they go first. Now, the rest of these slides will be after each side's turn, not at the end of the combined round. However, for round 1, both sides just moved up. So we're going to discuss both turn 1 in one slide. So first, the Lunar Knights. What did they do? Well, just like we discussed during their deployment introduction, we have the Peasant Militia in the top there. They moved straight ahead to close that gap on that left side of that dwelling. The spears, look how far up they moved, straight up that road, taking advantage of that movement action. We have we have the heavy cavalry that moved up, not completely as far as they could have, because they didn't want to get shot in the flank. They know those mounted archers of the Regal Guard have incredible movement, especially with that unit commander that gives them free reforms. So they just moved up far enough to where now they have a lot of range to charge somebody, but they didn't want to give up their flank this early to archers. Next to them are the mounted militia. As we suspected, they moved straight through those woods. They're now at the edge of the woods, so they don't have any further movement hindrances. And then on the far right for the Lunar Knights, those spears also moved up. So apart from those, the first unit of spears, which are sticking out like a sore thumb, the rest of the Lunar Knight army is in a cohesive battle line. So then the Regal Guard, starting on the left, we have those axes. Both axes moved up as far as they could. One's on the road, one is not. We have a dwelling kind of separating the army in half. On the right side of the dwelling are the mounted archers. The mounted archers moved up as far as they could, and, well, not as far as they could, but as far as they wanted to. That field does also cut movement allowance in half, just like the woods. The mounted archers could have moved forward, but they didn't want to get out there too much because they didn't want to be charged by those cavalry. So they got to the edge of the field and opened fire. They actually got a shot in at the heavy cavalry. You might notice there's only 5 figures in that heavy cavalry unit left because, yes, despite the penalty for moving and shooting, the mounted archers were able to do 2 wounds and take out one of the heavy cavalry. And then on the right, our swordsmen moved up. They are now also on the road, protecting the right flank of the mounted archers. Now we are going to go turn by turn, starting with turn 2 for Lunar Knights. Alright folks, and here is the beginning of the action. This is the end of Lunar Knights turn 2. We'll start at the top of the screen and work our way down. So as you can see, Peasant Militia actually double moved. Those kind of translucent neon green tokens are double move tokens, just so that now we know when the close combat phase of a turn begins that they cannot act in combat because they use both of their actions to move. So the Peasant Militia, who were going to, stay back and hold the gap behind that dwelling, decided, you know what, this battlefield with all these units isn't really long enough for the Regal Guard to maneuver around us. Let's just move into combat and, tie down these axemen as long as we can, because for the Regal Guard, those axes are the hardest hitting unit they've got. So Peasant Militia moved twice to get into close combat with the axes, and that's where they remain. Next to them are the spears. You can see a little blue token token, an arrow shape, that means they charge. That's right, they were on the road. They used one action to move into contact with the second unit of axemen. And if you move into contact and are able to continue your turn by getting into a close combat because you only used one action to move and your next action to attack, that is considered a charge. Doesn't really matter for spearmen, though, because they have a special ability called polearm, which means in the first round of a close combat, they are guaranteed to go first. No initiative roll-off like normal. Normally, a charge would give you an additional initiative bonus in that roll-off. But either way, that was our first close combat. Axes, a 3-point unit of axemen against a 2-point unit of spearmen. The combat ended trading some pretty big blows. Now, the spearmen did kill off one axeman, but in return, the axes managed to do 4 wounds to the spears, which means 2 spearmen down. Now, closer toward us, we have that unit of mounted militia. Keep this in mind, folks. Remember this moment when we, discuss the rest of the battle. Why? Because instead of moving the heavy cavalry into contact with the mounted archers, the Lunar Knight player charged in the mounted militia. Now, I shouldn't say charge, because they did take both of their movement actions to do that, so there was no close combat there this turn, but by moving into contact with the mounted archers, whenever you move into the front rank, the front arc of a unit that has a ranged attack, they get a free volley. The mounted archers took advantage of that. They did 2 wounds to the mounted militia, so they killed a figure of that unit. The heavy cavalry then, kind of using the mounted militia as a buffer, have moved and have their flank protected there in case the mounted archers on a future turn break away and try to shoot. The mounted militia will prevent, they kind of are an obstruction, preventing the mounted archers from being able to hit the heavy cavalry flank, but they're facing that way so that next turn they can maybe try to get up in that gap there between the spearmen and their mounted militia, and hopefully get behind the lines of the Regal Guard. And so then lastly, closest to us is the swordsman up against the spearmen. The spearmen move twice to get into close contact with the sword, so no combat this turn, but that is the end of Lunar Knight turn 1. Sorry, I should have said that was the end of turn 2 for the Lunar Knights, because this is the end of turn 2 for the Regal Guard, and thus the end of round 2. Starting again at the top of the screen, we have the first unit of axemen who were able to do 4 wounds to that unit of Peasant Militia, killing 2 Peasant Militia. In response, the Peasant Militia were able to do a single wound back to the axemen. The Lunar Knight players are really hoping those Peasant Militia last longer than this initial back and forth indicates they might. Next to them, 2 wounds apiece. The spears were able to do 2 wounds to the axes, killing a second axeman. The axemen were able to do 2 wounds to the spears, killing a second spearman. Or a third spearman, actually. That spearman unit is now panicked once a unit is at 50% or fewer remaining casualties, fewer remaining figures in the unit. Once they're at half or less, that means that unit is panicked. It's a -1 modifier to any future initiative roll-offs. Next, you can see that the the Regal Guard mounted archers were able to successfully break away from the mounted militia. That's one of the benefits of having that unit commander. It gives you an initiative bonus of 5. Now, that mounted militia unit only had an initiative of 1, so it was a 5-to-1 with a roll-off. Believe it or not, it was almost a failure for the Regal Guard because they only rolled a 2, but thankfully the mounted militia only rolled a 5, so it ended up being 7-to-6. You have to exceed in the roll-off. Not equal, but exceed in the roll-off in order to successfully break away. The mounted archers did. They shuffled over, as you can see there. They weren't interested in getting further shots off on the mounted militia. They had a juicier target in mind. They took a shot again at the heavy cavalry. Unfortunately, only doing a single wound, however. And then at the bottom of the screen, the swordsman attacking the spearmen. They traded blows. 2 wounds to the swords, 2 wounds to the spears. A swordsman and a spearman falling as casualties. So that is basically a third of the game over. Of course, the first round is all about positioning. But that is the end of round 2. We will start at the top of round 3 with Lunar Knights turn 3. Okay, this is the end of Lunar Knight turn 3. So, starting at the top of the screen, we had the Peasant Militia brace themselves. What a brace means is they don't take any action in their own close combat phase. They get an extra defense die during their opponent's close combat phase, assuming their opponent decides to take a close combat action. So, what are the Peasant Militia doing? They're just seriously trying to hold off those axemen from getting involved in the battle. And that's exactly what they're doing, acting as fodder, just sticking around, bracing themselves at this point. Just like the spears, as a matter of fact, also decided to brace themselves. Those spearmen next to them against those axemen, they're panicked, don't forget. And, you know, as long as those spears and those peasant militia hold up those axemen, while hopefully the rest of the Lunar Knight army wipes up the rest of the Regal Guard on the left side of the screen, then they've done their job. Just think about it this way. The spearman unit and the peasant militia unit combined, 3 points. That's a single unit of axemen up there is 3 points. So 3 points is holding up 6 points up there. So they're bracing themselves, hoping that they'll keep those heavy hitters at bay. Now, down further, again, Lunar Knights, not sure if this was the smartest idea. Mounted militia, charge into the mounted archers. Now, because, again, they moved into close contact with the mounted archers got a free volley. Now, anytime they're getting one of these free volleys, it does come with a move and shoot penalty because the rush of bodies at the archers, you know, makes it a little harder to aim. So they were shooting at a disadvantage, but they still were able to do 2 wounds, killing off a second mounted militia. Don't worry about those white dice under those movement templates. Those are just to keep those units standing because they're on the fields right now. But that charge did give a +1 initiative bonus to the mounted militia, which didn't necessarily help because, you know, again, the mounted archers have a unit commander giving them an initiative bonus of a +5. But either way, that close combat did take place. Now, in close combat, you can single out special figures like unit commanders. So they dedicated the 2 of the front rank mounted militia both against the unit commander. Now, doing that, singling out a unit commander like that does give the unit commander an extra defense die. So the unit commander only has 2 health. Thankfully, they were able to save one of their wounds, so they only took a single wound. The unit commander, though, is now down to 1 wound left. That leaves the last mounted militia in the front rank to attack just the regular mounted archer unit as a whole, doing a single wound. In melee, mounted archers are no good. They attacked back. They didn't do any wounds. And then, as you can see, the heavy cavalry snuck up in that gap there. Still, you know, it's the game's half over. End of turn 3 for Lunar Knights. Heavy cavalry have not gotten a single hit on anybody yet, so that's a little troubling. Next, you see the swords and the spears up against each other once again, trading blows, pretty much even Stevens. The swordsmen take 2 wounds, losing another swordsman. The spearmen take 3 wounds, losing another spearman and putting a wound on another one. So the spears are only 1 wound away from being panicked, but it's still kind of a stalemate down there. All right, moving over to Regal Guard, turn 3. Okay, this is the end of turn 3 for the Regal Guard, thus ending round 3. The game is now half over. Now, Regal Guard really went on the offensive here. Top of the screen, Axemen were able to eliminate another peasant militia. However, they did take a wound in return, so 1 axeman has been eliminated. That peasant militia unit has now been cut in half, so they are now panicked. And I should also mention this when the spearman unit got panicked last turn, is as soon as you cut a unit in half, you get 1 victory point. So then if you eliminate the unit entirely, you'll get the full amount of points for however much that unit cost. But cutting a unit in half gives you, no matter what the unit is, a single point, except in Peasant Militia cases, because they're only worth a point, so cutting them in half gives you half a point. So anyway, the Regal Guard just earned themselves half a point for cutting that Peasant Militia unit in half. Next, the spears. Oh my gosh, those spears only did a single wound to the axemen, so the axemen are still there with their, one guy still left in the second rank, but the axemen in return did 3 wounds to the spears, killing a 4th spearman and putting a wound on another. Now, the axemen have an ability called Fury, which means when they get cut in half, they don't panic. In fact, they get +1 to their attack die roll results. So it's like they're furious for seeing their comrades fall, and they get into an offensive frenzy. So then we have the mounted archers with that unit commander who wasn't slain, so he's still giving them initiative bonus of a +5. Easily were able to break away from the mounted militia once again. They backed up, and now they're taking a shot. Now, who did they want to take a shot at? Again, they target the heavy cavalry. Shooting at an opponent that's in a field like this gives the defensive roll a reroll. Now, as a matter of fact, the heavy cavalry already get to reroll defense die results 1 time. That's one of their special abilities. So the mounted archers decided, well, the heavy cav already get a reroll, so what? Let's just go ahead and shoot at them. They only did a single wound, though, so that is a second heavy cavalry gone. And then lastly, swords and spears. The tide is kind of turned here because the spearmen were only able to do a single wound to the swords. The swordsmen did 4 wounds to those spearmen. There's only 2 left, one of which has a wound on them. So again, that unit has been cut in half or less. So that is another victory point. So if you're keeping tabs right now, the Regal Guard at the halfway point of the game have earned themselves 2 victory points for cutting both spearmen units in half, and a half a point for cutting the Peasant Militia in half. The Lunar Knights have yet to score anything. So right now it's 2.5 to 0 Regal Guard. We're moving on to the end of the end of turn 4 for Lunar Knights. Alright folks, things are getting a little desperate for the Lunar Knights. I think maybe they heard me tally up the current points, so they're a little panicked. So what ended up happening here? Well, at the top of the screen you can see Peasant Militia brace themselves. Spearmen, who are not looking so hot, also brace themselves. They're trying desperately to keep those axemen back, while hopefully the rest of the Lunar Knight army does a little bit better in offensive combat. You can see the mounted militia moved through the crop field in pursuit of the mounted archers. However, even with both movement actions, getting through those crops wasn't easy, and then also having to reform to face toward the archers took both of their movement actions. They couldn't even quite get to the archers. The archers might have them right where they want them. In other news, the heavy cavalry finally engage an opposing unit for the first time this game. It only took 4 turns. Okay, so anyway, the heavy cavalry move into the flank of the swordsmen. Now, it took both of their movement actions to do this, believe it or not, because they had to navigate through the crops, reform, and get into position to move into contact with the swordsmen. But the heavy cavalry have a special ability called collision. Just imagine the heavy cav colliding with you. So that is a d6 number of collision hits. I can't remember off the top of my head how many hits they got, but it was enough to do a single wound, which killed off that last swordsman in the back rank. So now that swordsman unit is panicked, and since they were cut in half, Lunar Knights just scored themselves a point. Now, because at the time, the spearmen were also involved in that engagement, it was 2 Lunar Knight units to only 1 Regal Guard unit, so at that point, one of the Lunar Knight units could break away without having to roll for it. Being outnumbered means you can if you are outnumbering your opponent, you can break away without having to roll. So the spearmen just broke away. They moved straight back. They started on the road. Now moving backwards or directly to either side is at half speed. They started their movement on the road, however, so that's +2 to their speed. So even though their normal speed is 4, doubled using both of their movement actions would be 8, it ended up being they could move back a full foot essentially. That's as far back as they move there. We may or may not discuss later why that may not have been the most wise decision, but either way, that's the way things are looking. It is now going to be the bottom of round 4 after we discuss Regal Guard turn 4. Okay, and that is the end of round 4, end of Regal Guard turn 4. Starting at the top of the screen, Axemen kill off one more Peasant Militia. I mean, those Peasant Militia have done their job. They have soaked up the hits from those Axemen all game long. No wounds back on the Axemen unit, however, and then those spears. They had braced themselves, but they still took 2 wounds. Not enough to kill the unit, though. That banner bearer is all that's left of the spears with a wound on him. One more wound and that unit would be decimated. More than likely, the Lunar Knight players probably going to try to break that last spearman away and run for the hills, knowing they're faster than the Axeman unit, and then they can go hide somewhere, just to hopefully not spoiling anything for next turn. Anyway, the Axemen take no wounds in return. That was a big deal because they only had 1 wound left on someone in the back rank. If that spearman could have done 1 more wound, they would have cut those Axemen in half and scored a point for the Lunar Knights. Next, the mounted archers. They thought about just sitting still because, if they move and then fire, it's a negative modifier for a move and shoot penalty. But if they stuck where they were, those mounted militia would have gotten a charge on them and they would have had to suffer through a close combat, which they want no part of. So they did move back just far enough back so that the mounted militia won't get a charge off on them. However, that did mean their shots suffered a penalty and they only did a single wound to those mounted militia. And then the swordsmen actually tried to break away from the heavy cavalry, hoping that they may be able to pursue those spearmen because they wanted to take them out. They only had 3 wounds left. That's another point they're losing out on down there, but they failed to break away. Instead, they did pass a reform test, however, so they could face the heavy cavalry in their front rank. But instead of engaging in close combat, they're kind of pulling a Lunar Knight trick. They're just going to brace themselves there. That's only a 2-point unit of swordsmen against a 5-point unit of heavy cavalry. The swordsmen have already been cut in half, so I mean, what else do they have left to lose? So they're just going to sit there and hopefully soak up the heavy cavalry shots by bracing themselves. And now it's going to be the last third of the battle, starting at the top of round 5 with Lunar Knight turn 5. And here we see the end of turn 5 for the Lunar Knights, who are in almost full retreat. So at the bottom of the screen, you can see that remnant of that spearman unit double backed both of their movement actions to move even further back. I'll just say it now, that was probably a mistake, because now they're essentially out of the game. They couldn't even help the heavy cavalry deal with the swordsmen if they even wanted to at this point. The heavy cavalry traded blows with the swordsmen. They did 2 wounds, killing off a swordsman. The swordsman in return did a wound to the heavy cavalry. Heavy cavalry got to be careful now, because 1 more wound, they'll lose that last guy in the back rank, and that'll be a Regal Guard victory point for cutting that unit in half. And then you see the mounted militia. They seriously thought about pulling themselves back as well, maybe going after the swordsman, because they weren't sure if they wanted to take a free volley from the archers by moving into contact with them. But they figure, no matter where they go, the archers are going to pursue them and shoot at them anyway. So they decided, why not, at least maybe now, moving into contact with the archers. The archers don't have much room to go at this point. They have a little ways further back they can go, but at that point, the mounted militia will still be in charge range. So the archers kind of backed themselves into a corner, so they moved into close contact. Now, the archers, again, got a volley off, and they did that one more wound, which was all that was necessary to kill off that last mounted militia in the back rank. So, boom. Cut that unit in half. Victory point for the Regal Guard. Now, and that took both their movement points to get into that contact. So no close combat there this turn. And then you see let's start at the top. Let's continue on with the top of the screen. The Peasant Militia actually tried to retreat, tried to break away, because they figure their job is done. Just like that spearman. See that spearman that used to be engaged with the axeman? That spearman actually successfully broke away. And because they were barely on the road, that still counted, so it doubled their movement speed. They were able to get the heck out of Dodge. And now there's no way those axemen can catch up to them. They did their job. They held off the heavy-hitting axeman unit as long as they could, and they are out of there. Same with the Peasant Militia. They held that unit up. Those axemen are so slow, they're not going to be able to do anything. So we might as well, Lunar Knight players thinking, we might as well just pull out everybody because, save as many points as we can. But the Peasant Militia failed to break away, so they're just sitting there now bracing themselves once again. And now let's see how the Regal Guard respond to all this activity with the end of turn 5 for Regal Guard. Okay, folks, round 5 is over. There's only one round, one turn apiece for each side. However, let's discuss the end of round 5, which concluded with the end of the Regal Guard turn 5. So here's how Regal Guard ended up responding to all that retreating and nonsense of the Lunar Knights. Regal Guard. Up at the top of the screen, the axeman, who the spearman, that single spearman banner bearer, wounded, ran, hightailed it out of there. So those axemen really only had one opportunity left open to them, and that was to reform and move into the flank of those Peasant Militia. That locks the Peasant Militia down. You cannot break away if you are engaged on more than one front. So in this case, those Peasant Militia are stuck there. They only have 3 wounds left. And that's kind of getting ahead of myself, because I should also say during the close combat phase, that an axeman unit that was already engaged to them actually only did a single wound. So they did a wound to the Peasant Militia. So the Peasant Militia have 3 wounds left. Peasant Militia didn't do anything back to those axemen. And of course, the axemen that reformed and moved into their flank used both their movement actions to do that. So they didn't get to attack. So next round, the final round, those 2 units of axemen are going to hope to do at least a combined 3 wounds to the Peasant Militia and score that extra half point. Apart from that, the swordsmen at the bottom of the screen brace themselves. And in doing so, the Lunar Knights realize how big of a folly it was to move that spearman unit so far away. Ideally, what they should have done is kept them at charge distance, because now, with only 1 turn left, the Lunar Knights heavy cavalry has to try to do 4 wounds to finish off those swordsmen. If those spearmen were in charge range on their turn, they could also charge in and help the heavy cavalry. Between those 2 units is a lot likelier to do 4 wounds than it is just with the heavy cavalry themselves. And the spearmen wouldn't have had much to lose, because they'd only be in base contact with a single swordsman there on the flank who only rolls 2 dice, and the spearmen still have 3 wounds left, so it would have been impossible for the spearmen to have been, eliminated. So really, I think it was a misplay on the Lunar Knight side to back those spearmen so far up. However, Regal Guard suffered a major morale blow because, unbelievably, they failed to break away from the mounted militia. Top left up there behind the dwelling. Last turn, the mounted militia moved into base contact with the mounted archers, who had succeeded every breakaway roll they had attempted up to this point, because they have that unit commander giving them a +5 initiative bonus. So those mounted militia are panicked. They only had an initiative bonus of 1. They're panicked, so it ended up being a 0. Mounted militia rolled a 6. In order to break away, mounted archers rolled a 5. No, I'm sorry, rolled a 1. So they rolled a 1. 1 plus 5 is 6. Mounted Militia rolled a 6. It was 6 to 6. And remember I said earlier, in order to break away, you have to exceed your opponent's die roll, not equal it, but exceed it. And they tied at 6. Unbelievably, that means they are stuck there. So next turn, Lunar Knight turn, those Mounted Militia are going to get a close combat against the Mounted Archers, and more importantly, have another shot at eliminating that unit commander. All right, we will be back with the top of the final round, round 6. Okay, folks, this is the end of turn 6 for the Lunar Knights. Here is what happened. We'll start in the lower right, where those spearmen unfortunately just decided to stick there. They had no other options left open to them, so they stuck there. You see the other spearman, Banner Bearer, who was on the road. He ducked behind the dwelling there on the right. He did that because, you know, if the mounted archers on their turn, on the Regal Guard turn 6, were able to break away, assuming they would be able to, they could potentially try to track that guy down and shoot him and do the final wound necessary to collect that extra victory point. So that banner bearer decided to run behind that building to ensure that they are protected from any shots. Then, up at the top, the Peasant Militia obviously can't break away now that they're outnumbered, are just bracing themselves. Over on the left, behind the dwelling, the mounted archers had to take it on the chin. A close combat. The second attempt for the mounted militia to take out that unit commander, and they did. In close combat, the mounted militia did the last and final wound to the unit commander, killing him, scoring a victory point for the Lunar Knights. Additionally, they also did another 2 wounds to the mounted archer unit itself, so they are down a mounted archer. In return, mounted archers again aren't very good in close combat. They only did a single wound in return. Now here, though, may be where the Regal Guard victory has been sealed. The heavy cavalry, as expected, were not quite able to do the 4 wounds necessary to eliminate the swordsman. They did 2 wounds. They killed off a swordsman, leaving a single swordsman, just that banner bearer left. That banner bearer, in return, was able to do 1 wound to that last heavy cavalry in the back rank. That heavy cav unit is now cut in half. Victory point for the Regal Guard. And without, the Lunar Knights are done, essentially. Now it's all in the Regal Guard hands. That swordsman left can just brace himself and not have to worry about, a close combat with the heavy cavalry next turn. But anyway, let's now go into the end of round 6 at the end of turn 6 for the Regal Guard. This is the end of the game, the bottom of round 6, the end of Regal Guard turn 6. Here's how the game concluded. Well, at the top of the screen, the axeman that has that wound token there, if that unit would have suffered 1 more wound, they would have been cut in half. That would have been victory point for the Lunar Knights. So they were a little wary should they even engage in combat. Well, they wanted to kill off that Peasant Militia unit. A little greedy, perhaps, but they decided to go for it, which meant order of initiative was everything. That Axeman unit at the very top that had already been engaged to the Peasant Militia unit all game long rolled very poorly on initiative, and the Regal Guard player really needed both Axeman unit to roll well on initiative so they both could go first, because that Peasant Militia unit still had 3 wounds left. Now, the Peasant Militia unit rolled probably the poorest of all. Now, Peasant Militia start at base initiative 0. They were panicked, so they were a -1. You can absolutely be negative initiative bonus. They are also outnumbered, which is another -1. So they start out at -2, and they only rolled a 1. So their total initiative for that combat was a -1. Thankfully, the other 2 Axeman units both rolled positive numbers, and in fact, the unit closest to us with the wound token on it of axemen got to go first, and that unit did get to do all 3 wounds themselves. So that axeman unit eliminated the Peasant Militia. They get a free reform once a unit is destroyed, which I had just then realized that was the first time all game and only time that a unit was eliminated in its entirety. Everyone else has just been cut in half or badly wounded, but that was the first full unit to be eliminated from the game. So that axeman unit that killed the last figure there got a free reform and is just facing toward us. So then the swordsman at the bottom of the screen actually tried to break away. They thought, well, maybe we can break away, and well, obviously that wouldn't have been a wise idea, because then, you know, hypothetically in a round 7, if there was one, the heavy cavalry could have ran them down and done collision hits by moving into contact with them and all that. But they failed to break away anyway, so they just sat there and braced themselves. So that combat never took place, and that's just, they ended up surviving. So then the last thing that the Regal Guard attempted was they actually did break away from the remnants of the mounted militia unit. So even without their unit commander, mounted archers are a +2 initiative bonus. Those mounted militia were panicked. They are only a base initiative bonus of 1, so being panicked meant they were initiative 0. So 0 to 2. Mounted archers rolled well enough to break away. They thought about trying to maneuver so that they could get a shot in at that spearman unit in the lower right. Without the unit commander, though, they're not quite as maneuverable. They're still one of the most maneuverable units in the entire game. They just had to get to basically that crossroads of that dirt road. They needed to get a little bit closer to that spearman unit than that crossroads section, because they have a foot of range. Unfortunately, without their unit commander to give them free reforms, they wouldn't be able to get that close in order to also take a shot, because they thought they had still have 5 mounted archers left. Let's have all of them take shots at that spearman unit, maybe do 3 wounds, maybe kill them, but no, they couldn't get there. So instead they took shots at the mounted militia unit. The mounted militia unit had 5 wounds left, and there's 5 mounted archers. Now, because they moved, they'd have a move and shoot penalty, so the odds were incredibly slim that all 5 of their penalized shots would hit and wound, and the mounted militia wouldn't block a single one. But they gave it a shot. They did a single wound, killing off another mounted militia, but that is where it stands. So here is the final standings of the game. Let's actually take a look at each army's survivors and calculate the points. And here we see the remnants of the Lunar Knight army. So the Regal Guard were able to decimate quite a few of the Lunar Knight units, cutting in half or more both units of spearmen, the unit of mounted militia, and even the heavy cavalry unit, not to mention completely obliterating the unit of peasant militia. So to add it up, all 4 of these units visible on the screen now are cut in half. That's 4 points, plus a 5th point for completely eliminating the peasant militia. Regal Guard scored 5 points. Now let's take a peek at the Regal Guard survivors and see how many points the Lunar Knights racked up and who ended up winning the battle. And here we have the survivors of the Regal Guard, specifically the Dawn Regiment. Who do we have left? Well, both units of axemen survived. Neither one was cut in half. The unit of mounted archers survived. It wasn't cut in half. And even that final swordsman banner bearer is still alive. So what does that mean? What did the Lunar Knights actually kill? Well, the Lunar Knights were able to cut that swordsman unit in half or more. So that's a point. And the Lunar Knights were also able to eliminate in that final turn the unit commander that was attached to the mounted archers all game long. So How many points is that? That's a point for cutting the swordsman in half, a point for the unit commander. That's 2 points. Regal Guard scored 5. Lunar Knights scored 2. It's 5-2 with a victory for the Regal Guard. Hence why the Baron's Ruby Ring has been presented to the Regal Guard, the Dawn Regiment. So who are the MVPs of this battle? Well, honestly, the unit commander did so well for those mounted archers, constantly breaking away, firing, doing wounds to the mounted militia, to the heavy cavalry of the Lunar Knights, but also the axemen. Maybe not necessarily the axemen unit that was tied up by Peasant Militia all game long, but that other axemen unit who were able to whittle down that spearman unit to a single banner bearer, and then also ended up finishing off the Peasant Militia. And even the swordsmen, I mean, they stuck around. They held their own against the heavy cavalry, cutting them in half eventually, also at cutting in half that other spearman unit. So it was really, honestly, a team effort all around. Things to do differently. Well, unfortunately for the Lunar Knights, there were several. First, I would say get the heavy cavalry involved. At the beginning of the battle, it looked like that was their game plan. They shot the heavy cavalry straight up, but instead of engaging the mounted archers with the heavy cavalry, I think they were a little gun shy. They didn't want to get free volleys on the heavy cavalry, so they stuck the mounted militia against them. But the mounted militia weren't able to do as much offensively. The heavy cavalry just kind of stuck around for half the game without doing anything. The heavy cavalry needed to be more involved. Also, at the end there, moving that spearman unit out of charge range, not able to help the heavy cavalry eliminate that swordsman unit, that was also a big mistake. But overall, a fantastic battle. Congrats to the Regal Guard. I think that's pretty much all there is to say. Thank you all so much for listening, and until next time.